Hello, I'd like to talk to you today about the last professor, and I subtitled this LMS, New Mandarins, and a Sub-professorial K-16 future. Ordinarily, I don't like to read slides, but let me make an exception here. My thesis is this: learning management systems, sometimes known as LMSs, ascend at the expense of customary collegiality and motley academic freedom in higher education. They represent the stealthy creep of neoliberal mentalité by a Mandarins of Methodology, the sort of governance long entrenched in K through 12. Higher education is in danger of becoming K through 16, sub-professorial, unmotley. This would diminish both the American achievement of liberal education and the life chances of students. The demographic transition over the past several decades from a predominantly tenured Tier 1 professoriate to a predominantly adjunct Tier 2 lubricates this process. Neither Tier 1 professors nor academic unions have offered much resistance to what we might call adjunctification, for want of a better term. The result is that a teaching force comprised mainly of adjuncts is also in a poor position to resist creeping K through 16. Is this an era of the last professor? Doctor, my brain hurts. Perhaps some listening to this talk may sympathize with Mr. Dog, but let me see if I can unpack some of this denseness. Although the title of my talk is The Last Professor, its subtext is the potential role of learning management systems in aligning higher education with the values and practices of K through 12, and the contribution to this by the long-term erosion of tenure and the development of a largely second-tier faculty labor market. I got going and thinking about these issues when I read a very interesting review in the New York Review just before the pandemic broke out by Charles Peterson, a review of a number of books which he called Serfs of Academia. One of the books to which this led me was Wendy Brown's Undoing the Demos, about which I'll speak presently. Her book in turn led me to another book from which I cribbed the title of my lecture, The Last Professors, the Corporate University and the Fate of the Humanities by Frank Donahue. And I think Brown and Donahue see largely eye to eye on most things. She would add something though, and again, we'll come back to this. Neoliberalism and where Donahue says corporatized university, I think Brown would say financialized university, and in so doing, she follows very explicitly Gerald Davis's analysis of how financialization has come to predominate in the last several decades. As she has a talk on that, you can see the URL if you want to follow that, and I'll speak about that presently down the road. But as to Donahue, though he is not unkind about it, in chapter 3, which he calls the erosion of tenure, he looks at a key factor in the decline of the humanities and liberal education as he sees it, and that key factor is adjunct faculty. The relative preponderance of adjuncts has coincided with the relative erosion in the proportion of faculty with tenure. The academy is dwindling down to its last genuine professors, this is Donahue's thesis, because more and more the preponderance of, quote, professors is of second-tier adjunct status and not first-tier tenured status. This is bound to diminish liberal education. Brown agrees that the growth of neoliberal governance in higher education provides diminution as well. It is one part of what she calls a larger stealth revolution of neoliberal mentalité. One of the merits of Brown's analysis is the way she frames neoliberalism isn't just limited to supply side economics, the sort of thing to which Block and Summers, for example, have drawn our attention in their recent work on Karl Polanyi. For Brown, neoliberalism is broader than supply side. It concerns legitimation. It's a kind of direction. It's a species of rationality, and she cites both, interestingly enough, both Max Weber and Michel Foucault on this. As she puts it, a distinctive mode of reason, a conduct of conduct, in Foucault's phrase. It's a sort of thing embraced not only by von Hayek, Friedman, Greenspan, Thatcher, and Reagan, but also by Clinton, Blair, Bush, Obama, Biden, by the Democratic National Committee establishment of the Democratic Party, and by New Labor, as well as by their nominal Republican and Tory adversaries. Neoliberal rationality, as Brown uses this term, is no more narrowly limited to professional politicos than to specialist economists. She was asked in an interview, who is a neoliberal today? She gave this interesting response. I would invert the question, she said, to ask who is not a neoliberal today. It's quite hard to escape neoliberal rationality, including for those who imagine that they are radically critical of it. They are still all trying to boost their market value, their return on investment. It's become so ubiquitous, she says, that we hardly notice it. Words don't matter, as Popper tells us, and of course he's right, except when they do. I think here's an instance when they do. And I'm going to introduce a term that Brown does not use, but I think which captures the spirit of what she's trying to say. Rather than neoliberalism, which can't help but conjure the narrow financial meaning she's trying to avoid, I'm going to use the term neoliberal mentalité, which I borrow from Manal's school, Mark Bloch and all that. It lacks the Schimpfwort quality of the English counterpart mentality, but it captures the broad generality of mindset or even rationality, while at the same time sidestepping the approvative flavor of the English rationality itself. What Brown notices about the neoliberal mentalité, as I'm calling it, is what earlier Durkheim and Weber had noticed about instrumental rationality, and it's worth reading what she has to say here. Neoliberal rationality, she says, disseminates the model of the market to all domains and activities, even where money is not at issue, and configures human beings exhaustively as market actors, always, only, and everywhere as homo economicus. Widespread economization of heretofore non-economic domains, activities, and subjects, but not necessarily marketization or monetization of them, then, is the distinct signature of neoliberal rationality. She also notices that it tends to advance by stealth. She says it's more termite-like than lion-like. So we're not dealing with Leo here. We are dealing with Chewy the termite. A termite infestation, however stealthy it may be, still amounts to a hostile takeover. And if termites are not lions, neither are they paper tigers. There's a Copernican aspect to this picture, and this is where Gerald Davis picks up. Brown doesn't use the Copernican metaphor. Davis, who she quotes, though, does. Again, I'm not going to read the whole passage, but those who are watching on YouTube can, of course, pause and read it at leisure. But Davis's major point is during the financial restructuring in the 1980s and 90s, the corporation was transformed from a social institution to a mere contractual fiction oriented toward shareholder value. What emerged could be called a portfolio society, in which the investment idiom becomes a dominant way of understanding the individual's place in society. Personality and talent become human capital, and the guiding principle of financial investment spread by analogy far beyond their original application. So Davis is giving us a tale of the world we have lost. His tale doesn't have the magnitude of change from the England of Shakespeare, Cromwell, and Newton that Peter Laslett, of course, told us. However, Davis's change has been quite rapid, also quite general, and it has been so massively reorienting that the Copernican metaphor would seem to be not an inaccurate one. In a matter merely of decades, the United States, and of course other countries as well, has gone from a society in which corporations provided for large segments of the population career paths, pensions, and the functional equivalent, as close as the United States ever got to a welfare state, to a society in which employment is now continuously right-sized, corporate functions are outsourced, the bottom line is much more decisive than ever before, and individual employees can no longer expect stable career paths, can no longer expect health benefits, can no longer expect retirement income. The advent of what Davis calls the portfolio society and its notion of human capital is a general change portending specific changes in education. It is the secular cause of a transformed mentalité with which we deal. The investment idiom encourages the public, including students, to think of education in a neoliberal fashion as a private good. A return on investment, the term ROI crops up again and again, to be calculated and recouped. It configures human beings exhaustively, always, only, and everywhere as homo economicus, again, Brown's phrase. It encourages the tendency, of which course, there are other sources. To think of education mainly as a credentialing process, the sheepskin is a crucially important commodity. It adds shareholder value to the individual as they build up and market their own portfolio of human capital interests. With respect to higher education, neoliberal mentality isn't just the iron ladies, market metrics, isn't just the big gippers, tuition hikes. There's a broader consensus at hand. As Brown asks, who is not a neoliberal today? When Obama, for example, wanted to rate universities by the products they produce, by the return on investment they produce, we're seeing the same thing here at work, getting a bigger bang for one's buck. With respect to higher education, neoliberalism is reductive, and this in a way that strikes at some of its core purposes. There's a takeover, and it too is hostile as well as stealthy. In general, neoliberal mentality reduces human activity to economic activity. Likewise, it reduces education to training, heavily vocational, and its contribution to, quote, human capital, unquote, enhancement. It reduces students to shareholders seeking private return on investment. Donahue's erosion of tenure over the past half century is a precondition for the further development of Brown's neoliberal stealth revolution in American higher education. It is an extinction event. Neither the eroded Tier 1 tenurable faculty nor the expanded majority Tier 2 adjunct faculty are in a good position to resist the sort of neoliberal governance foreshadowed in the UK by the Research Excellence Framework, the REF, and related reforms, as they're genteelly called, nor the inroads being created by learning management systems and distance instruction, as these are developing now throughout higher education, both in the US and around the globe. To understand why the erosion of tenure and the displacement by adjunct labor might act in aid with further intrusion of neoliberal mentalité into higher education, it would be helpful to think a bit first about what adjunct labor is. So, what is adjunct labor? From the last third of the last century till the present, tenure-track faculty have made up a decreasing proportion of faculty in American higher education. If you look at the chart here, you'll see how this works over a 40-year period from 1969 to 2009. The tenured faculty has gone from above 3/4, almost 4/5 really, down to about 1/3, and the adjunct faculty proportion has increased correspondingly. So that we arrive at a situation today in which by far most people teaching courses in colleges and universities are employed on a contingent basis. Little or no job security, markedly lower compensation. Often no health care nor retirement benefits into the bargain. They're called adjuncts, an interesting term. It means appendages, not really essential. If we take the same data from that chart and put it in an area chart rather than a bar graph, it looks like a large demographic transition over 4 decades, from a 1-to-4 ratio adjuncts to tenured to a 2-to-1 ratio adjuncts to tenured. The previous charts suggest about 2/3 adjuncts on the average right now. This seems to vary by type of school, as this chart, which I've compiled from data in Peterson's review article, show. Surprise, surprise, surprise. It's lowest at the more prestigious schools, public PhD granting, R1, etc. Highest at the for-profits, 50%, and that's not low, but that is the low. In the upper echelon universities, up to 90% at the for-profits. Community colleges have the next highest, about 80%. I teach at a community college, which is a little better. They're about in the mid-70s, and my particular department is relatively low at about 60, but still, again, 50%, 60%, not really low. Peterson's article and the books it reviews suggest various reasons for this sea change over the past several decades, and these include things like explosion of non-academic staff, especially at the upper echelons, vice presidents for whatever. The decline in public financial support for higher education as the tax base is reduced overall, and as more of the tax base that's left goes to mandated K-12 programs, therefore cutting further into the budgets for higher education. Also, adjuncts being strung along and hoping against hope that there's a tenured line about to interrupt if they simply pay their dues in the trenches for now. Peterson, though, neglects to mention in an article which he calls The Serfs of Academe, one factor that has to be reckoned, I think, is critical, and that is this. Why is there such a vast population of adjunct serfs ready to be strung along in the first place? How is it that most of the essential labor in colleges and universities, need we spell out what that is? How is it that this is today done predominantly by workers defined as non-essential appendages? Why does academe even have its serfs? Didn't always. Surely the emergence of serfdom must have something to do with shifts in overall labor supply. For every tenure-track job, and it's been this way for quite some time, there are hundreds of applicants, fully qualified, PhDs in hand, always, they must at university level, but even increasingly in the community colleges as well, most with teaching experience, lots of publications. This is a very extreme labor market. Try to imagine any other occupation in which on Monday morning there are 100 people or more queued up outside the corner office saying, I can do better, pick me, I can do her job. It typically doesn't happen. Aspirants to teach in higher education, though, face just this sort of extremely skewed labor market in which the supply of labor far outstrips demand for it. I wrote a little blurb about this in Lingua Franca about a quarter century ago. The contemporary university is a machine for producing a surplus population of PhD holders. Who could design it better? You know how it is. Academic departments are rewarded based on FTEs. How do you boost FTEs? Well, you encourage people to major. But despite our best efforts as teachers, students have this annoying habit of graduating. And hey, there's always graduate school. Same old, more FTEs. But then they also graduate there. And so there's this pileup of qualified people with graduate degrees in hand. Throughout the whole process, nobody is even looking at it and asking, is there a mismatch or a match between supply and demand of labor? It just doesn't happen. What's an adjunct? Is an adjunct a certain type of person? Well, only in the sense that the rich are different from the rest of us. As Hemingway told Fitzgerald, they have more money. In the case of adjuncts, of course, inversely, they have less money. But beyond that, adjuncts are not less qualified. They are not less adept at teaching. They are not lesser breeds without the law. A basket of deplorables, a certain kind of low-level helot kind of person. To the extent that the adjuncts may be a certain type of person, the most accurate thing to say is they are a type of person willing to accept substandard pay and other conditions. As Donahue notes, and I take this passage to the right from his book, there may well be confusion even on the part of tenured counterparts how many there are, how many poorly they are paid. And again, I won't read this to you, but if you're watching on YouTube, of course, you can hit the pause button. It's worth reading what he has to say here. Rarely they have adequate office space if they have any at all. Rarely have a voice in departmental meetings. Tenured faculty may be entirely oblivious to the condition of the serfs they pass in the hall or on the quad. Students and their fee-paying parents may be oblivious as well. Sometimes this is deliberate. The NYU faculty handbook has a non-disclosure clause, expressly forbidding adjuncts to share conditions of their employment with, quote, their students, their consumers, or others. Student is consumer indeed. Now, I don't work for NYU. So on the first day of term, I include a short talk on money in higher ed. My general approach is PP&E, although my subject is philosophy, not economics. Somebody needs to tell students about this, and I kind of think the econ prof isn't going to do it, so they may as well hear it from the likes of me. We discuss tuition, including when tuition is free or was free, or affordable at least, student debt, the college premium, the relative thrift of community college attendance, and so forth. I tell them that most of their professors are earning between perhaps $20,000 and $25,000 a year. They depend on unemployment checks between terms. They sometimes need to sell blood plasma to put food on the table. I wonder if they believe me, because for most people, a professor is a professor is a professor is a professor. Only they aren't. By comparison, in my local public school district, K through 12 teachers start out at $53,000. They top out at $86,000. Paraprofessional special education assistants start at about $20,000, top out at about $25,000. Because of the need for them, they often get the opportunity to work summer schools, so their salaries may go up as high as about $40,000. Adjunct professors are much closer to the paraprofessionals in K through 12 locally than they are to the teachers in K through 12 locally. Adjuncts are a precariat. They are the seasonal field hands of academia. And as with seasonal field hands, the wolf is always at the door. They can't really say no. Kind of like peasants. Peasant economies have been likened to men standing with their feet on the bottom of a lake and their noses just barely above the water level. They're just getting by. The slightest change, sometimes even the slightest change for the better, can swamp them, threatens their survival. They are very precarious. They're precariat. The lower end of post-industrial society, gig workers, for example, are precariat too. Adjunct professors are gig work pioneers. Of course, the term comes from musicians, but the adjuncts have been doing this for 40 and 50 years before we began talking about a gig economy as such. Like peasants, adjuncts exist on the margins of survival. The slightest wave might swamp them. Let's look at one school in detail. I've put up salaries here because this school, and we'll call it College X, although it is an actual place, is a public school, and therefore the salaries are public. And I've boxed in Tier 1, the tenured or tenurable faculty here on the left, and Tier 2, the adjuncts in this particular department on the right. The range in tenured salaries about 85 to 154,000. The adjunct range about 6,000 or about 44. The highest tenured salary of the department chair is about 3.5 times the highest adjunct. Now the chair is an outlier. 150,000 is pretty extreme, but closer to 100,000, six figures, is more typical. If we take the next highest tenured and just leave the outlier out, still got more than 2.5 times the highest adjunct salary. 4 of the 6 tenured faculty pull down 6 figures. The remaining 2 are pretty close. The 9 adjuncts pull down barely enough on which to live. College X is a community college. It has a heavy teaching load. Full-time is 10 courses a year. Adjuncts are limited to no more than 6, so they may teach in intersessions as well. And of course, they may also supplement their income with other gigs. This could be courses in other systems. This could be Uber. This could be McDonald's. This could be sex work, any number of things. So the low figures that they receive for adjunct teaching may not comprise all of their income, but they're still pretty low. I want to read between the lines here. The highest adjunct, the $44,000 a year guy, probably teaching 4 courses in the regular year and 4 in the intersessions, which amounts to 8/10 of a full-time load in this system. But pay is far from parity. Once again, if we take out the outlier, the average for the tenured is 103,000, and 44,000 is 0.4, not 0.8 of this average. And as Donahue, this is again from Donahue, notes 12% of adjuncts work at least 3 jobs. Now imagine a faculty meeting with this group. They teach some of the same courses. All their students receive full transcript credit. It isn't that if you take a course from an adjunct, you receive just adjunct credit. That may sound a little silly, but there have been times when that's been tried. Abraham Flexner's very interesting book, Universities, American English, German. I'm going to come back to that in a minute because I want to suggest to you that it's worth reading after all these years. The University of London, between the wars, teachers were divided into recognized and unrecognized, and only students of the recognized teachers could count their work toward a degree. But we don't do that here. Adjuncts are underpaid and underemployed, and lots of things can be said about them, but their students are not. This doesn't redound to their students, to their transcript credits. They get full credit. So basically, the adjuncts and the tenurable are doing the same work. And yet, the top 2 quintiles at this hypothetical meeting are paid a good salary, though it's a heavy workload. They receive health benefits. They receive livable pensions. The bottom 3 quintiles are paid about 50% for the same work, but are underemployed with no paid health benefits. They're eligible for pensions, but being underpaid for decades is going to redound against what they recoup in retirement as well. So here they sit as colleagues, shoulder to shoulder, Tier 1 and Tier 2 in perfect harmony, those with the dollar signs, those with the penny signs. The conventional wisdom is that for teachers, defined benefit pension averages about 60% of active duty pay. So the average among the tenured faculty got about 103,000 in this department. reduces to a pension of about $62,000, and in California, none of them are eligible for Social Security, so pension is it. Yet, $62,000 may be livable, whereas the high adjunct active duty figure is 71% of the tenured pension, and the corresponding adjunct pension would be about $26,000. Have that same adjunct with an 8/10 workload been paid parity with the tenured average, his pension would be about $49,000, about double, in fact, what it will be. The so-called highly paid adjunct loses each working year compared to parity, and then loses only $23,000 annually during retirement, and again, all with no health insurance into the bargain. Did some financial calculations today. Apparently, if I retire at age 63, I can live comfortably for about 16 minutes. Let's say, for the sake of argument, the highest paid adjunct works 40 years, gets a master's degree at 24, retires at 64. Okay. Over the course of their working life, such a person has kicked back, in effect, $1.5 million in foregone salary. Now, any alum who donated $1.5 million would have a building named in their honor. Any adjunct who kicks back the same princely sum, shall we say, is not honored. Doesn't even get the Russell Jacoby folding chair at UCLA named for them. From a strictly monetary point of view, all adjuncts count as philanthropists. Alas, although there are some metrics applied to them, adjuncts are not so counted. Adjuncts are also like restaurant servers whose bosses, often enough some of the major celebrity chefs, although the McDonald's as well, routinely and systematically withhold pay, typically millions of dollars, become an issue lately. The chief difference, though, is the restaurants do this surreptitiously and it's illegal. College and universities do it up front and it's legal. They do this to the majority of their faculty. And this is not only the celebrity schools. So, appendage, seasonal field hand, server, philanthropist, flexibility unit, fungible, expendable, professor. And this little humanities department at this little college X, there are 9 adjuncts there kicking back. One begins to see how reducing labor costs in this fashion helps the bottom line, particularly given neoliberal tax cutting overall, vis-a-vis spending for higher education. Despite its function for the bottom line, Donahue finds, however, no evidence that this has happened because of orchestration. It seems to have been decision by accretion, although one could quarrel with that. Some do. But it seems to me this makes sense. Think of it like payday loans. Make a decision this month, it constrains the same decision next month. Decision accretion becomes a habit, except in this case, of course, school administrators are gaming with other people's money, not their own money, as in payday loans. Money diverted from salaries now is not going to become magically available in the future, so once this bandwagon gets rolling, it keeps rolling. Decision accretion proceeds gradually, and one can hardly notice that it's happening. Kind of creeps up on you. It's easy to see why administrators would cooperate with accretion. What's not so easy, at least for me, is to see why faculty, including faculty unions, would do likewise. Didn't anyone imagine, once we started down this road, that a 2-tier labor force is going to harm the first tier? And it happened not just here and there, but everywhere. Is it simply natural that faculty would be sharks to other faculty? Is there some kind of inverse human kindness law governing the practice of high-mindedness? The more apparently disinterested, exalted, and creative the profession, the less human kindness members show to one another. I don't know. Don't faculty want to place their own students strategically once they do graduate? But in any case, drift was gradual. Did anyone in this process imagine that adjuncts would ever come to comprise 50 to 90%? If easy does it, easy also undoes it, undoes the demos and the academy. I don't know who discovered this or why. I can't imagine boiling a frog, but they, you know what they say about boiling a frog. Start out in cool water, increase it gradually, and you'll get the job done. Cheap teaching, as Mark Bousquet says in his analysis of this, is not a victimless crime. Besides stunted adjunct lives, full-time faculty have stood on the sidelines while the situation transpired, but it will affect the working conditions of the last professors left. Cheap teaching is also bound to have adverse effects on student life chances, on their quality of life. Faculty second tier grew simultaneously with white-collar unions. I'm old enough to remember when there were professors who disdained the notion of AFT because it was a union that was blue-collar. And eventually unionism caught on to a certain extent in higher education. Neither trade unionists nor Tier 1 faculty senators pushed back on the growth of Tier 2. Why not? That's a very good question. Despite the fact that perhaps 2/3 of faculty in public colleges and universities are unionized, are faculty unions as smart as police unions? Police unions, Mark Bousquet has a bit on that again, control who gets to practice. Okay, want to be cops don't get to be cops. They control training, they control entry. So in contrast to police unions, teachers' unions exhibit, this is Bouquet's conclusion, a failed monopoly of professional labor. And why that should be so, I think, is far from clear. In any case, we come across the decline of, we come to a point which we have the decline of Danish dominion. This is the title of a book by Shelley Halsey, published now nearly 40 years ago, before Mrs. Thatcher's RAF really got going. It concerned erosion of faculty power by the post-war expansion of higher education in the United Kingdom. Since those days, of course, RAF has grown into something of a nightmare. We don't fortunately have that in this country. Students are consumers, says Lord Mandelson, just before hiking trembling tuition in 2012. They must demand ROI. Businesses must guide course formation. Market metrics, such as ranking of research on a scale of 1 to 4, quantitative influence of publications, etc., have gotten to a level of micromanagement that we don't know here, unknown really elsewhere other than the UK. And I don't know why this is. E.P. Thompson, back in 1969, 70, protested against this at the University of Warwick. I'm not sure why the Brits are more like this than the Americans are. But certainly accountability in the accountant's sense has set in very deeply into British higher education. Let's look at market metrics in education versus education as a public good. Again, things have not gone so far in this country as in the UK. But as Brown puts it, educating human capital has gone pretty far nonetheless. Local tendencies in education are part, again, of the broader secular transformation. Brown identifies 4 key transformations in the neoliberal stealth revolution, as she calls it. The framework of market metrics makes public goods harder even to speak of. Governance via market metrics, expertise, and the best practices displaces popular sovereignty and the rhetoric of justice. Subjects are configured no longer as citizens, but as consumers, as self-investing human capital, knowledge, thought, training. These are valued almost exclusively for their contribution to capital enhancement. Consider Brown's first point. The framework of market metrics makes public goods harder even to speak of. From 1868 to 1970, tuition at the University of California was free. In Germany, it still is. Yet, how much must we in the U.S. bend over backwards today to consider education as a public good? Mark Blythe, an economist at Brown University, has an interesting thing to say about this. Let's listen to him.
So how much does it cost to do a master's degree in the United States just now? About $50,000 private, $30,000 if you go public. Why does it cost so much money? Well, because the privates can do it because they're very good and they can take talent from all over the world, and they also redistribute a lot internally because they've got money and all that. Why do the publics do it? Well, basically because states have been cutting taxes year after year for the past 30 years, and there's no money left in the kitty, so you end up jacking fees up. Now, let's say you want to do engineering, something that if you don't go into finance with your skills ends up benefiting society because you can build stuff and all that's really good, right? And you spend $30,000 and that's an investment over your lifetime and all that, and that's the way to look at it. In Germany, you get to go for free. In Germany, you can be an American. This is absolutely true. Check this out. You as an American can go there if you qualify for one of their engineering master's programs, and they will send you to the Goethe Institute for 6 months before you start so you learn German. You will then get a free education at the best technical universities probably in the world outside of MIT and Caltech. And then they'll let you stay because you will be a high tax paying productive member of society. How's that for different?
That's a lot different. Oh my God. So that sounds like, see, in America, for some reason, we see education spending or college spending as a cost instead of an investment. And it seems, but which it is an investment, and people don't understand that. So why should we pay for you to go to college? Because it's actually an investment in our own country. That's what you would say?
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, although I'm not paying back the British Exchequer for the money they invested in me, I'm paying a boatload of taxes here in the US, even if your overall tax rates are lower, because I basically went from somebody that should have been either basically on drugs or in prison or in the army and ended up at an Ivy League in a professorship. Well, surely that benefits society as a whole, that I'm not out there mugging grandmothers. Instead, I'm out there educating their kids. So...
yeah. One of the several unfortunate consequences of these transformations is that demos will be undone locally, no less than globally. For more and more students, the college experience is becoming just vocational training masquerading as higher education. Lots of STEM, lots of distance education, courses taught by overburdened casual tier 2 seasonal laborers rather than traditional tier 1 professors. And it's already, of course, gone pretty far in this direction. This would be a major diminution, both for individuals and for the greater good. Wendy Brown has something to say on that. Let's listen to her.
I think it's important to start with a recognition that one of the extraordinary things that the United States did in the 20th century was expand public higher education in ways that were just unimaginable from another time and from any other place in terms of how many people had access to it and what it was trying to do. And what I mean is, especially in the post-war period, the amount of money, federal and state money, invested in public higher education, combined with the GI Bill, combined with the opening of doors to women and to others who had heretofore been excluded from higher education, especially racial minorities, but also working class whites. What this did was essentially make the United States a model for the world. And I rarely speak about the US this way because it was a century that was also dreadful in other ways for the United States in terms of imperial things and in terms of many other endeavors. But on higher education, it was truly a model and a golden age. And essentially, what that period involved was making high quality public higher education available to any qualified high school student by making it pretty close to free. And the example I'll offer is my own. When I went to the University of California in the early 70s, the cost was about $600 a year. That was tuition and fees. And the cost of room and board was another couple of thousand. I was able, as a student who did not get support from parents, from a family, to be able to take a part-time job and thrive at the University of California. That's no longer possible for a variety of reasons. The total cost of the total state support now for the University of California hovers around 12% of its budget. And the rest of the budget comes from tuition and from private donors. What has this done to education? That's the important question. What has it actually done to both the research component and the education component of our public research universities? One thing it's done, of course, is make education increasingly contoured toward the question of return on investment. That is, very few students of working class or let alone poor or even middle class means can look at a college education, as we did in my time, your time, as something that has to do with expanding your capacities as a human being and your capacities as a citizen. Instead, the question is, how much money do you put in for how much you will get out as a potentially higher earner at the other end. And that in turn has a tremendous effect on education itself. When you're asking how much do I put in for how much I might get out, instead of courses that expand the mind, the soul, the character, the citizen capacities of our students, increasingly the demand by students, by their families, by our administrators, is to provide really high-level vocational education, not courses that either steep you in the histories, geographies, cultures of the world, or literatures, arts, and so forth of our past and present possible future, but technical educations, especially in what are called the STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, and math. And even in the social sciences and humanities, the question is always, what does this do? What does this contribute to one's earning capacity at the other end? So everything has to be justified in terms of that earning capacity. And what does that mean? That thousands of years of Western civilization priding itself on developing culture, arts, and the human being itself, and producing and reproducing and advancing that through higher education, is essentially being thrown aside in favor of higher education as an economic machine to produce a higher value of human capital at the end than it had at the beginning.
So, following World War II, the United States succeeded, as Brown says, in, quote, making high quality public higher education available to pretty much any qualified high school student by making it pretty close to free. It was, as she puts it, a model for the world, a university upon a hill, as it were. And it was a time, she says, in which a broad, if not deep college education, one inclusive of the arts, the letters, sciences, became an essential element of middle-class membership. No mere instrument for economic advancement, higher education in the liberal arts was the door through which the descendants of workers, immigrants, and slaves entered onto the main stage of history to whose wings they were historically consigned. Viewed thus as a public good to be subsidized publicly, higher education greatly expanded the opportunity structure for many Americans who previously would have been excluded. It increased the life chances for many of them beyond what might have been predicted from the circumstances of their origin. Let's look a bit at this, the growth and decline of student life chances. The term life chances, of course, comes from Max Weber. Ralph Dahrendorf, in his exposition of this, says the following: life chances are a function of options and ligatures. Sometimes ligatures loosen, then options may expand. Then life outcomes become harder to predict given simply a knowledge of social origins. In this way, the opportunity structure expands. You're going to need a bigger mold. Dahrendorf reconfigures Weber's notion of life chances with the metaphor of a mold. It can be broken, and an expanded mold can replace it. And in Dahrendorf's terms, what Brown describes is the breaking of an old mold and the creation of a bigger mold post-World War II, one in which the life chance of a humanistic higher education came to be expanded. Exactly what was it that expanded with this breaking of the small mold and creation of the newer, larger one? Higher education was expanded, it was supposed to expand last story in at least two ways. A broad grounding in the liberal arts was supposed to, one, act as one of the conditions for upward mobility and middle-class standing, but also to prepare a well-educated public comprising free Kantian actors pursuing eudaimonia, not just homo economicus concerned with mere zoe, with bare existence. The achievement here, again, as Brown makes clear, was not just the expansion of vocational technical training, it was rather the extension of a broad liberal education to those whose social origins, whether they be working or middle class, women and ethnic minorities included, people whose social origins would previously have ruled out this particular life chance. So in effect, humanity became the target audience for what we call the humanities. Matthew Arnold's famous the best which has been thought and said in the world, not just for the toughs anymore. In other words, expanded life chances were twofold, simultaneously socioeconomic, yes, but also intellectual. The broader slice of the populace was offered a chance at Bildung, its self-development within liberal education, and this was to equip them better for a life of eudaimonia, of middle-class citizenship, under the presumption, of course, that the middle class would remain stable. Now, all this took place under a specific set of economic conditions, what the French call les 30 glorieuses, the 30 glorious years after World War II, which saw an expansion of the economy, which saw an expansion of the middle class, which began to level off starting in the 1970s. We'll come back to that point subsequently, but there is clearly a larger economic side to these changes. It's a good question whether what expanded during the post-war era might be continued once post-war economic conditions have altered, as clearly they have now. Whether students today and tomorrow can expect the same expanded life chances, or whether they're going to have to settle. But first, let's consider what this sort of life chance expansion meant to the sorts of students for whom it was now on offer in the post-war period. Wendy Brown gives her own story as an example of the difference that this could make. So does Mark Blythe. Brown worked your ticket to get through university where the tuition was $600 a year. Blythe should otherwise have ended up on drugs or in the army or mugging grandmothers. Both of them got expanded opportunities of which they both took advantage. My own story is not dissimilar. I too began with a happy experience of life chances expanded improbably during the recent past. My outcome was different. I failed to gain a career in academia. In the process, though, I think I did gain some distinct perspective on what's happening in higher education today, hence my talk here. So, how to lose a career and gain a life. Bluto Blutarski with his college sweatshirt, that was me. I was told all my life, you're going to college, you're going to college, you're going to college. My sister and brother as well, we all did. So did our 3 first cousins. My father retired as a soldier in 1970 after 30 years of service. My mother began as a secretary, retired as a clerk in civil service. My father's father was a plumber. His mother was a switchboard operator. My mother's father was a timber mill worker, ended up as a janitor. Mother's mother was a housemaid. There were some dead white European males among my ancestry, but we were clearly not toughs, I think. We were working class, jumped up to lower middle class. Like Wendy Brown, someone from my background would never have been college material pre-World War II, but America democratized higher education and made it affordable. Professor Brown mentions paying $600 in fees. Until Governor Reagan introduced tuition a little earlier, UC was free to qualified students like Brown. Since then, tuition has risen more than any other cost. Look at the chart on the left, bottom left. This is over the US overall, but certainly true of California. Of all the prices that have risen, higher education tuition has risen the highest 1,200%. At Brown's own school in recent times, increased tuition inversely tracks neoliberal tax cuts, as she notes in her talk. Well, I left K-12 in 1971, Key West High School, class of 71, went to Michigan State. I was, like Professor Brown, also able to afford higher education. Money was tight. My father had just retired from the Army, and there were 2 siblings behind me, but by a combination of parental subsidies, scholarships, loans, summer jobs, work study, I was able to pay for it without even imagining the sort of crippling student debt that has now become the new normal. Money aside, leaving K-12 for higher education was personal liberation. One could argue with professors. I did. They were mostly interesting to talk to. There was an anti-war movement. I saw in my profs a decidedly anti-authoritarian streak. In philosophy, there were ideas. In sociology, too. There was NPR and College FM. There was New York Review of Books. There was this massive library. One could get lost in the crowd. Managerial surveillance was minimal, certainly compared with K through 12. Freshman year at Michigan State, one of what were then called multiversities, I was one undergraduate among 30,000, and there were about an equal number of graduate students on campus as well. The 30 or so of us in honors freshman seminar had Noam Chomsky all to ourselves for several hours in one class session, just freshman seminar. And the reason for that was that we had Herbert Marcuse scheduled, but he canceled at the last minute, so we had to settle Chomsky. There was such freedom, personal as well as intellectual. No more hand-holding as in K-12. No more spoon-feeding. No more Mickey Mouse. In loco parentis was on the run. We were on our own. Many of us were poor. I know I was. But unlike many of my classmates from K through 12, I didn't spend my 20s in shackles. I wasn't nose to the grindstone, under industrial surveillance, rugrats, juggling mounting debt from paycheck to paycheck, looking forward to almost inevitable alimony. I was in charge of my life. I was free to inquire, and there would be no going back. For someone of my family and social class background, what higher education gave me just seemed extraordinary. Later, I would experience grad school as among the best days of my life. I know that's not everybody's experience, but I was lucky. The point is, I developed a taste for independence, a taste for some of the best qualities of academic life. I was one of those for whom, improbably enough, higher education provided a gateway to Bildung and eudaimonia. I can't speak for Brown or Blythe. I can speak for myself. I went from cannon fodder, or maybe cubicle fodder, to college material. I can say on my own behalf that at least one descendant of proles was not harmed in the process of exposure to the best which has been thought and said. Did life chances expand? Yes. Was this a good thing? Yes. Graduation, 1983, brought a rude awakening. When a tenure track appointment fell through at the last minute, I did what I swore I would never do, and that is to teach, quote, part-time, unquote, as it's sometimes called. Actually, and in my case, this is true, it was more than part-time. I moved from the University of Pittsburgh, where I'd studied, to Philadelphia, and between Temple University in Philadelphia and Rutgers across the river, I taught double the full-time load. Rutgers paid $1,625 per course. Temple paid $900. Then it was the lowest in the U.S. My chair at Rutgers thought I was worth more than that and was kind enough to argue for it with the dean. The dean, we all called him Jabba the Hutt. And here's what he told her. Cut that crap, Myra. He's just a first-year PhD. They're not worth any more than we already pay them. Well, you know, by his own lights, Dean Jabba was absolutely correct. Labor supply in an extreme buyer's market drives down labor price. There was a reserve army of fungible PhD holders just like me, and there were more in the pipeline. So 2 years in, and no serious tenurable prospects, 3 years customarily marked the death knell, I had the honor to report to the Internal Revenue the princely sum of just under 14,000 annual earnings, and that again was for double full-time load. So that would amount to about 16,500 in today's dollars. I quit. I moved to California. I went into business, into the wine trade, actually. One of the things I learned up at university, part of Bildung is learning to care what comes out of one's mouth, but another part of Bildung is learning to care about what goes in. And I did very well in the wine trade. From there, I was lured into a full-time appointment in one of the local community colleges, full-time but not tenurable. And so after 2 years, I played out my eligibility there and had to find yet something else to do. Why had I quit part-time teaching in 1985? Because it would have ground me down. It would have killed my enthusiasm for teaching. I couldn't now in 1988 go back to that as a livelihood. Whatever paid work I might find there had to be something better than trying to eke out mere physical existence solely under the conditions offered to adjunct labor. So my solution was I bumped downward. I took a full-time job in K through 12. Thought I'd left that all behind for good in 1971. Well, I hadn't. But my K through 12 job paid a livable salary. I wasn't anybody's tier 2. I had the option of full academic holidays, or I could take an extra workload for extra pay, my choice. I received full benefits, including health care, and I received a defined benefit pension at the end. Yes, indeed, 'tis compensation devoutly to be wished. Ours is a society in which any unionized high school teacher can hope for a decent middle-class life, while the average college teacher, whether they be union or non-union, cannot. That's an interesting commentary. But Having gotten an acceptable day job, now I was able to gig after hours. I taught philosophy, mostly, sometimes sociology, at a local community college, and I was able to enjoy it. I didn't have the wolf at the door or the gun at the back. I've been doing this for going on 28 years now. I've been temporary. I get a notice every term, you know, you were, for the purposes of the ed code, you were hired for just this term, blah, 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 blah. Even after I retired 2 years ago from my day job with K through 12, I've continued to teach philosophy classes, and I love doing that. I lost a career, but I got a life. If this isn't already too boring, I spent some time putting this story out at some length. It's on my academia.edu page. There's the URL down there if you want to follow that up. I discovered France. I went back home to München, where I'd grown up as a boy. I got to visit some of the ancient sites I mentioned in lectures, to walk the streets, to see the architecture, the art. I had many great meals, much fine drink. I now enjoy a retirement in which the wolf is not at the door. I have time to read, to think, to write. I am basically hippie vagabond undergrad once again, just a little older and with a little more money this time. Now, when I say that, it doesn't mean that I've gone back to paying tuition. As I tell my own students, schooling is going to make you narrower and more specialized in the short run, but your education doesn't have to end once your schooling does. There will always be tons of stuff to read once you've learned to learn until Alzheimer's takes over. Well, you've got the rest of your life to think. The two biggest weaknesses in my undergrad experience were in mathematics and in economics. To the extent that I may understand economics, perhaps it's even because I never took one of those econ classes, but I read Marx and Nietzsche instead. However, now I have time to read and swat up a bit more on these topics, and I'm doing that up in my, well, you can't see it from here, but up in my upper shelf, I've got a whole stack of books on math. Where did the concept of zero come from, for example? Stuff that I missed, but you know, there's time to pick it up. And there's also this very marvelous, if you don't know this, I recommend it, very short introductions series from Oxford University Press. You can read most of them in less than a day. It's kind of wiki, but it's usually written by those who know their stuff, and I've been swatting up a lot of stuff there. Incidentally, I mentioned to my doctor recently that in retirement, he said, how's it going? I said, well, you know, I'm back to being an undergraduate. He was horrified. And I thought about it, and I thought, well, yeah, there's probably a reason for that. He took pre-med while I was reading philosophy, psychology, religious studies, sociology. Probably a very different experience. But the point is, I obtained what I at least regard as a really decent education in the humanities and social sciences without debtor's prison at publicly funded colleges and universities. It's a gift that keeps on giving. I just worry, as Brown does and others, Donahue, that my own students and subsequent generations of students are not going to get the same chance. That it'll be all pre-med, except they won't have an MD at the end. As I recount in my longer version, How to Lose a Career and Gain a Life, even in adjunct status, I've never enjoyed less than full academic freedom. Less than full pay, yes. By and large, my teaching colleagues took me for wherever I might be. My scholarship was well received. Matters were professorial, usually. I was underpaid, yes, but I always felt I was doing something serious, doing something important for my students, as my own professors had done for me. I had the unique advantage of a professorial life in my night gig to teach in sense one. I'm going to explain this distinction later, contrasted materially with my day job to teach in sense two. This is what makes me skeptical today, as I detect a drift into sub-professorial conditions in higher education, a drift into conditions uncomfortably like those of K through 12. And let me spell it out. I have in mind here the spread of learning management systems. So let's look at LMSs for a bit. The decline of Danish dominion and of student life chances. Partly, but not entirely, due to the COVID pandemic, distance education and learning management systems are expanding. As I am coming to discover, the labor conditions of distance education are sub-professorial. On my campus, the following decree has appeared recently for those teaching online in an LMS format. Feedback to instructors, if a course is found not to have sufficient regular effective contact, will include a recommendation for additional training and for recurring deficiencies, assignments for face-to-face courses only. How would such a deficiency be detected? Here's the policy on my campus. I won't read it, but basically there will be monitors lurking in the background of electronic distance courses. These will be clerks with checklists, as well as some of the usual folks in the academic chain of command for evaluation. So long as the pandemic emergency measures continue, all courses on my campus are going to be monitored by the campus distance education director and or one of her staff in conjunction with the department chair. Directors and clerks, as well as the chair, will have administrative access to lurk from weeks 5 through 12 out of a 16-week semester, checklist in hand. What if there's a disagreement? Well, you can appeal to distance education. But don't worry, it's not a personnel evaluation, except in its consequences. It is a personnel evaluation, and especially so when it's an actual personnel evaluation. Non-evaluative evaluation, that's kind of like administrative law is to law. It has the effect. It's a personnel evaluation, first of all, outside collective bargaining and its grievance procedures. These are scheduled and involve the usual academic chain of command, the department chair, the dean, etc. But distance education evaluation involves ongoing drop-in, unannounced surveillance by another office entirely. Secondly, any instructor found deficient faces sanction. Now, the sanction is not termination, only banning from distance education unless distance education covers all course offerings, which it looks like it may do in the short run as the pandemic goes on, in which case it's effective termination de facto, if not de jure. By union contract on my campus, I hold relative seniority for my discipline, but as my chair told me recently, Canvas, which is the LMS my campus uses, Canvas trumps seniority. So that all goes out the window. So I may very well face the following soon. Sorry, old boy, it's the summary judgment of this tribunal that after 27 years of holding lectures, your manner is no longer appropriate. Submit to re-education or see what's behind door number 2, but you have a choice, of course. After 27 plus years of satisfactory evaluations at my campus, the goalposts have moved. My future work evaluations, as well as my continued employment, will now depend on a clerk lurking in the background to monitor my courses, ticking the appropriate boxes on a checklist. Here's the problem. Professors do not report to clerks and accountants. This is not academic freedom. This is not how a professional occupation conducts itself. This is not teaching as I have come to know it in higher education. Reporting to a clerk is sub-professorial, and I refuse. Here's our stealth revolution. This is actually kind of funny. On the one hand, I have adjunct status. I'm on Donohue's analysis part of the problem with the erosion of tenure, the American version of the decline of Danish dominion, quite so. On the other hand, even as a mere tier 2 employee, I do have the wherewithal to act as one of the last professors and to refuse this particular extension of what I regard as substandard working conditions. As a result, I may very well be shown in the near future door number 2, the end of my run. But as Dean Jabba noted at the beginning of my run, there's always more where they came from. Would I be missed? Or my departure wouldn't even be noticed. Velociraptor says, the last professors are dinosaurs now. We are seeing an extinction event. No, I'm not the very last professor. It simply amuses me to note that despite being in adjunct status, and therefore presumably part of the problem with the decline of proper tenured professorships, I'm somewhere there among those last professors. Number our days. But will someone someday be the very last professor? So when it's time for the lights of higher education to be extinguished, one's tempted to ask the last one out the door, please to ensure the switch is off. But no, perhaps there will never be the very last professor. It's an optimistic view, no? No. More than likely, a high-level humanistic education may remain available at Darwin universities, at small colleges like the Amhersts, the Bryn Mawrs, etc., for a select few students. This is what Wendy Brown worries about. Donahue also. The grandchildren of today's Princeton and Swarthmore students may still be taught by tenured professors, and just nobody else. However, one might wonder just how professorial could these last professors afford to be? With only a handful of them around the entire country, would they have any bargaining power with the universities, or would it all be grace and favor? To what extent will Donahue's last professors resemble Nietzsche's last men? Of course, one funeral at a time may settle it, but on the other hand, one smallish lineage of dinosaurs did survive. Having a great vocabulary didn't save the thesaurus from extinction, but the birds survived. You know, birds are right-sized, air-mobile dinosaurs, so there will be some survivors. In the demographic transition that's going on here, there is a sociology of yes men, there is a demography as well. As we've seen, adjuncts are already a majority of the faculty, and their proportion may well increase even more. After all, if it's only 50% in the R1 universities and it's all of 90% in the for-profits, and there are gradations in between, there is still some room for growth. Adjuncts are also a precariat. They already accept substandard working conditions. How can they possibly resist more inroads of the sort of sub-professorial conditions I see developing on my own campus, for example, in the growth of distance education, and learning management systems? I generally don't like to engage in pop psychoanalysis, but on the other hand, one sees what one sees. Recently, I've dipped my toe into the water of LMS training. I'll talk more about that presently. And I couldn't help but think I'm seeing a lot of identification with the aggressor among my fellow adjuncts undergoing the same training, Stockholm Syndrome. And I don't want to say this in a cruel way. A precariat is precarious, and one grasps at defense mechanisms when one is under attack. But genuflecting to LMS may very well be the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, just as it is the spirit of spiritless conditions. If higher education does come to resemble K through 12, the preponderance of adjunct labor easily could furnish a means to bring this about. Any doubt that LMS as a type of neoliberal governance over higher education would make ready use of such conditions? As it is, neither Tier 1 nor Tier 2 seem to be chanting, hell no, we won't go online, as David Noble says. So, K-16, is it the future? Non-evaluative evaluation is to evaluation as administrative law is to law. Stealth, accretion, the sort of governance, one example of which I cite above, my own campus, in which lurking clerks with checklists are given at least veto power over teaching, is currently being applied specifically to online instruction. We'll see why presently. It represents a departure from and a break with the usual norms of direction in higher education and a step toward the norms of K through 12. Once such a precedent gets set with regard to online classes, why would the same norms not then be extended? You're going to hear about regularization, consistency, accountability extended to all instruction. With the majority of faculty being a Tier 2 precariat, could there even be any pushback were this to happen? I'm speculating, but I think it's within the realm of possibility. Education or training, what is it that we're doing in higher education? I mentioned Abraham Flexner before. In addition to reading Brown's book, coming across that, it was a pleasure to read this book, 1930. But I had only heard of Abraham Flexner in terms of his effect on the history of medical education, but he's got a very interesting analysis on the cusp of the Second World War, which of course shifted the balance from German universities to American universities worldwide. He's caught it right before that transition happens. But there's a lot of stuff in there which still merits us reading. Here's what he said about American education. American education holds the well-nigh universal faith in being taught, as though education were really a matter of taking courses, being instructed in person or otherwise, passing examinations, and storing up credits, quote unquote. Information can, perhaps, be measured by credits, not, however, education. Education is something for which the primary responsibility rests upon the individual, and a wise teacher will realize the narrow limits within which he can be helpful. Flexner, in other words, speaks from the standpoint that education is Bildung, which he defines as a good definition, Knowledge, culture, the power of expression, character, manners, a rare balancing of qualities calculated to equip men to meet with dignity and competency the responsibilities of life. Bildung is a concept at the core of the idea of liberal education, which, as Brown, among others, reminds us, is rooted in the word liberus, the Latin word for individual freedom, and denotes the education appropriate to free men, in contrast to slaves, its education geared to fit citizens for the responsibilities of life in a demos, rather than, let's say, being consumers. Writing in 1930, Flexner found German and English universities strong in this regard, American ones weak. American universities already carry on too much like secondary schools, he said. They use the same credit system. They spoon feed their students as if they were children. They confuse information with knowledge. They think like accountants. They train in specifics where they should cultivate in very general terms. Still, it might be said of them at that time, they honored Bildung, if only in the breach. In K-12, though, Bildung is honored neither in the breach nor in the observance. This is meant to be an empirical observation, not metaphysics. That is to say, I don't want to be the one to suggest that K-12 is this way because somehow public school or high school or anything prior to university education has to be the way that it is. For example, schools in Finland are conducted very differently from those in the US, as Diane Ravitch, among others, has been reminding us recently. In Finland, she says, quality control, quality certainly does not owe its success to test-driven instruction and curricula, nor does it have to do with, quote, teacher accountability, unquote, campaigns, as they have been called in the United States. Such approaches would have no place in a trust-centered nation like Finland. So it seems to me that this is far from inevitable. Wouldn't higher education be the better were K-12 not the way it is? Who understands better than professors that an educational chain is no stronger than its weakest link? We are the ones who start with freshmen who come out of this process, and we all know what toll it takes. We'll come back to this presently. Let's look at the differences between higher education and K-12 a little more. How does higher education differ from K through 12 in at least two key ways? The doxa of the one is diametrically different from that of the other, and doxa I'm going to define and develop a little bit. Tacit ruling assumptions, we'll talk about that more below. Secondly, the direction of higher education depends on trust, largely in a self-governed, discipline-based faculty, while that of K-12 distrusts mere teachers and regulates their conduct through continuous surveillance by non-discipline-based instructional leaders, instructional managers, presumably in command of generalized managerial skills and methodology. With the intrusion of learning management systems, by the way, here are some of them. I mentioned Canvas on my campus. There's Whiteboard, there's Coursera, there's Etude. Some of you may have heard of any of these. There are at least 272 of them on the market. They are, of course, on the market. They are corporations vending a product here. With the intrusion of LMSs, one might very well ask whether Brown's stealth revolution of neoliberal mentalité is transforming the doxa behind higher education, aligning it with the doxa that has come to define K through 12 in this country. Because of legal mandates designed to ensure accountability in newer distance education formats, precedents are being set for novel forms of micromanagement in higher education. These precedents are outside of and parallel to traditional academic direction, as well as of and to collective bargaining. The thin end of the wedge may well expand the purchase of the large wedge, and once a precedent gels, becomes a best practice, as the current jargon has it, it may move the direction of traditional formats into conformity with the new precedent. I want to suggest that what Brown identifies as the stealth revolution of neoliberal mentalité, taking over place over the last several decades, had, in fact, certain antecedents that are a bit older. And I want to look at two of them, the notion of the new Mandarins and the notion of instructional leaders. There is the managerial mindset that Chomsky described as that of the new Mandarins in a book of that title. That mindset, in turn, did not just begin with the Cold War. It had antecedents in the manner in which K through 12 has been governed all along. Schools of education and their grads have long seen themselves as new Mandarins of Methodology, omnicompetent generalist instructional leaders. The Mandarin is a bit of organizational culture, a meme, which might readily be exapted. Again, I'm using a lot of technical terms, potentially expanding K through 12 governance to K through 16. In order to think about this, though, let's take another piece of verbiage. Let's examine the question of doxa. Doxa, of course, a Greek word. Plato used this to denote what Galbraith would later call the conventional wisdom, a set of ideas which are at the very least doubtful, which most people place their credence. One might call it a mentalité. Pierre Bourdieu, the sociologist, uses doxa in the same way, except that normally such ideas are tacit, taken for granted, what Michael Polanyi might call the tacit dimension. Tacit doxa may interchange with explicit opinion. Bourdieu's use of the notion of doxa, doxa for Bourdieu, let's put it that way, is undiscussed while opinion is discussed and explicit. Opinions will run the gamut between the orthodox and the heterodox. Doxa fixes the more general boundary of what's thinkable and what's unthinkable. It sets the background terms for legitimation of the foreground discourse. If you know Daniel Hallen's spheres of the, particularly the sphere of deviance and the sphere of legitimate controversy, this may be very much like that. Those two spheres are permeable for Hallen. Why shouldn't they be permeable also in Bourdieu's scheme? It should be possible to take the tacit, to surface it, to examine it, to criticize it, to move it from tacit doxa to explicit discussion. Normally, unless we do that, it remains tacit. But what is normally undiscussed might still be discussable. It seems to me there is possible permeation there. So let's look at, respectively, the doxa sets of both these enterprises. Seems to me that the doxa of K-12 consists in at least 4 propositions. K-12 presumes, first of all students want to learn always. Secondly, education is the same thing as information or content transfer. Education amounts to whatever tests measure, and teachers are providers of information or content. A currently popular political conclusion from this is that if test scores are down, then K through 12 teachers are failing because they're not correctly transferring content to all the eager, willing receptacles. Horses led to water will always drink. The famous Newsweek cover, fire bad teachers, fire bad teachers, fire bad teachers. There's one and only one cause of educational failure, and that is bad teachers. Are these 4 presumptions true or false? It seems to me that the last 3 are pretty clearly false. The first one we might hesitate. It may not be empirically true that all students want to learn always, all the time, but as my friend Robert Burton calls our attention to self-fulfilling prophecies, and particularly the Pygmalion effect in education, though, we might, as teachers, still want to carry on as if number 1 were true, whether or not empirically that is so. Okay, from the doxa of K through 12, let's turn to the doxa of higher education. Higher education, it seems to me, presumes, again, at least 4 key points. First of all, for students, self-selection is self-interest. Secondly, education is a process of actively wrestling with intellectual challenges, not of passive information transfer in the first place. Thirdly, tests are imperfect at best. Fourthly, teachers are facilitators. The doxa of higher education, in other words, is one of Bildung, as Flexner says. The individual student has agency. The individual student is responsible. The wise teacher will recognize that they can be helpful, but also that there are narrow limits here. Education is not just a matter of merely acquiring a fund of information. It is not a matter of passing exams and racking up a tally sheet of credits. Flexner calls attention to an important point concerning the psychology of education on which these 2 doxas differ. Education, he says, is something for which the primary responsibility rests on the individual, unquote. We delegate the student as agent. Thus, education will be differential. You can lead a horse to water, they may not drink. K through 12, on the other hand, presumes that student motivation is high and constant. Thus, deficits in motivation can be due only to some drag effect from deficient teaching. Teachers in the doxa of K through 12, have both the agency and the duty to ensure things called learning outcomes. If the horses fail to drink, they must have been badly led. So for K through 12, motivational psychology is mandatory. For higher education, motivational psychology is discretionary. Thus, in short, between these two sets of expectations, the doxa of K through 12 and the doxa of higher education, there is a great gulf fixed. Hand-holding, spoon-feeding, and Mickey Mouse micromanagement characterize K through 12. And in making the transition to higher education, students typically need to unlearn this. They typically do catch on to the differences, and if not, this comes at their peril. Drew Appleby, an emeritus psychology professor, taught psychology for more than 40 years, noticed a high dropout rate after freshman year, so he's a research psychologist. He asked some questions. And what he found was that many students come in the freshman year simply assuming what got them by in K through 12 was going to get them by in higher education. Here's what he says. As a result of this unawareness, they treated their freshman year in college as if it were their 13th grade in high school, and therefore failed to adapt successfully to the new academic environment because they were either unable or unwilling to change the behaviors, attitudes, and strategies that helped them to succeed in high school, but which caused them to fail in college. So 13th grade is the problem. And in his survey, he came to the conclusion there are 7 crucial differences between high school and college. He discovered by asking his students. First of all, academic expectations are much higher. Student-teacher contact is less frequent and more formal. The syllabus, hold that thought, replaces teachers' daily reminders. Homework is done after, not during school. Students must be more independent and responsible. Students are treated more like adults than children, and students must learn to prioritize and manage their time. Here are some of the things that his students said in response to his survey. College teachers expect more from you. There are no late assignments or makeup tests. They do not hold your hand. The biggest difference between high school teachers and college professors is that you have to learn by yourself in college. High school teachers tell students what to do the next day. College professors expect students to read what's due in the syllabus. High school teachers told us our assignments. College professors tell us to read the syllabus. College teachers don't tell you what you're supposed to do. They give you a syllabus and expect you to follow what it says. High school teachers tell you about 5 times what you're supposed to do. So less hand-holding. Here are some more observations by Appleby's students. High school teachers teach you what's in your textbooks. College teachers expect you to actually read your textbooks. College teachers expect students to read the syllabus, and the classroom is set up to where to sink or swim. Do the work or fail. High school teachers reminded us about the deadlines for projects every day and tried to help us if we were struggling. The most important thing I've learned since I've been in college is that it's time for me to step out of the purgatory between my teenage years and adulthood and take some responsibility for my life. So, no spoon feeding, no Mickey Mouse. RTFS. Oh, what does that say in English? Please read the syllabus. Gee, I wonder, does that t-shirt come in men's sizes too? Where do the 3 most questionable bits of the K through 12 doxa come from? Answer, from behaviorist philosophy of education. This is an outlook that's long ago taken hold in the university schools of education, which train the K through 12 teachers. The philosophy of education here is hardly even the correct phraseology. Learning is the preferred jargon of behaviorism. The transfer of information, measurable in the simplest terms, allowing likewise simple accountability measures. It is the converse of Bildung. How's that working out? The doxa of K through 12 also lends itself well to neoliberal governance of the sort found in those learning management systems, Coursera, Etude, Whiteboard, Canvas, etc., all the others, now becoming prevalent in distance education. To view education in this manner lends itself better to centralized monitoring and control. In fact, this sort of governance has long been a feature of K through 12. Control is uniform and centralized. Curriculum is mandated at the state level. Credentials are issued from there as well. Locally, large school districts manage thousands of credentialed employees. Credentialed employees are fungible content providers. Accountability is provided by, among other things, the simple measure of test scores. So the K through 12 mentalité rests upon a view of accountability, which is particular. It is an accountant's view of accountability. More than a century ago, Veblen detected this whole process at work. Again, I won't read the whole passage to you. You can pause and read it. Learning is a merchantable commodity, he said, to be produced on a piece rate plan, rated, bought, and sold by standard units, measured, counted, and reduced to staple equivalents by impersonal mechanical tests. This was a tendency found in universities already at that time. The first and unremitting duties of the staff are those of official management and accountancy. Veblen attributed the accountancy concept of education to at least two distinct causes. One was a generalized cultural preference in America for business-like standards as providing general standards for all governance, and the scale of organization. He found the accountancy concept of education to have been pioneered in K through 12 and worried that it was extending to university governance as well, even that long ago. Nonetheless, even today, there remain a few marked differences between K through 12 and higher education. Here's one good index. If a teacher is absent in K through 12, they must call a substitute. What's a substitute? Just another fungible content provider. There's a standardized lesson plan. Presumably any anonymous substitute can apply to continue normal content delivery. And correlative with this, it's commonly expected that any outsider walking at random through any classroom, this could be the principal, this could be the superintendent of schools, this could be a member of the Board of Education, this could be any parent, that they will glimpse immediately, transparently, what's being taught and how well. And this kind of walk-through observation is routinely used as an evaluative tool. In higher education, by contrast, there are no subs. The instructor of record is not just a flexible fungibility unit. There's no requirement for standardized lesson plans. Rather, the instructor is trusted as a representative of their academic discipline to decide on the course of instruction and carry it out. Yes, they do so within some boundaries, but the same course by Professor X may be very different from Professor Y. Y is not just interchangeable with X, so one cannot readily substitute for the other, and we don't call substitutes in higher education in case of an absence. Here's another index. In K through 12, if a parent complains about a grade, the principal can and often will order the teacher to change it. Refusal is insubordination, subject to disciplinary action. In higher education, in my state anyway, the teacher is by state law the instructor of record for any courses assigned. Only the instructor of record can change a grade. If there's a complaint about a grade, goes to the department chair first. Department chair says, yeah, there's merit here or there's no merit here. If he decides or she decides that there's merit, then a conference can be convened. The student can put their case for why the grade was wrongly given and should be changed. The instructor can agree or disagree. But if the instructor doesn't change the grade, there's no question of insubordination. There's no question of disciplinary action. No such micromanagement is even thinkable. Here's a good example. In the recent pandemic, the chancellor of my system sent a memo around asking faculty to exercise leniency in grading. Now, what he requested made perfectly good sense, but despite coming down from above, it was a request. There are other differences between K through 12 and higher education. All colleges, even community colleges, have a faculty senate. There's nothing like this in K through 12. Those with administrative credentials govern. Those with mere teaching credentials are governed. Lehrfreiheit, academic freedom, is not a concept in K through 12. There are other differences. Simply having a degree in chemistry does not qualify one to teach chemistry in K through 12. One must undergo additional training, including supervised teaching, and then be recommended by University School of Education for a state-issued teaching credential. This has some absurd consequences. In the state of California, no Nobel Prize winner is qualified to teach their Nobel Prize winning subject in K through 12. A teacher of undergraduate chemistry is not qualified to teach 11th grade chemistry to their students' younger siblings. Not qualified, unqualified. They're not teachers until or unless, one, they have passed a test called the CBEST. It's a basic skills test, simpler than the SAT. And without having first undergone supervised student teaching and been granted the appropriate teacher credential. My worst case absurd scenario is Suppose, God forbid, Harvard closed down tomorrow. Well, wouldn't it be nice for California if they could snatch up all these unemployed Harvard faculty and put them to work teaching AP high school classes? Nope, they couldn't. Arthur Schlesinger Jr. is not qualified to teach high school history. Stephen Jay Gould, not qualified to teach biology, geology, any of the sciences which he teaches at Harvard, or taught at Harvard. Yeah, so, but that there's a certain perverse logic here. Community colleges in my state, and I think other states as well, came out of K-12, once had similar credentials, although without the student teaching requirement. They have since joined, for 50 years now, the rest of higher education with the view that holding a graduate degree in an academic discipline is the core rule for being trusted to teach in that subject. So that's another difference between K through 12 and higher ed. For all one can say about inroads, there are still some key differences. And this brings me to that distinction I drew a little earlier. The verb to teach means drastically different things in higher education than it does in K through 12. I'm going to use teach in sense one. This denotes what's done in a motley, differentiated, by a motley, differentiated, trusted, competent member of an academic discipline entitled to academic freedom. To teach in sense two denotes activity by any uniform, fungible vehicle for content delivery, accountable to supervision by a non-discipline grounded instructional leader or learning manager. The difference then is pretty sharp. For K through 12 teachers, all in all, they are just another brick in the wall. The doxa of higher education relies on student agency and initiative in order for education to take place. In it, teachers in sense one are trusted to facilitate a process of building. The doxa of K-12 reduces education to learning and promises that its teachers can guarantee minutely specified learning outcomes. In it, teachers sense two are managed and surveilled to ensure that this happens. Which brings us to the notion of a learning management system. What is it, and how might it function to ease a transition such as I dread from K through 12 to K through 16? Well, let's unpackage. There are three elements. There's learning, there's management, and there's system. Learning, first of all. Behaviorism's stand-in for education. Why has Skinner been so popular in schools of education? Learning is a very shallow conception of the broad range of things that might go to make up an education. But for Skinner, this is a feature, not a bug. Skinner's general psychology is meant for a riposte to any depth psychology whatsoever. His philosophy of education as learning follows suit. Now, one might respond to this criticism that behaviorism has a very, very shallow concept of education by pointing to something like Bloom's taxonomy. People often do. Nominally, it addresses higher order thinking, after all. But does it? Notice that knowledge, defined as information, is the basic but also the lowest order term, and then Bloom merely dogpiles all the rest. For what purpose? To make higher order cognition equally mechanical and manageable. So now, not only mere information, but also understanding, application, analysis, synthesis, and evaluation are all subject to a checklist. Thus, Bloom is a supplement to Skinner's basic shell, and it's not an antithesis or a remedy. And once we begin to imagine, for instance, that critical thinking is a commodity that can be trained and managed by checklist, and how many people do that, then we're already pretty far down the neoliberal road. Skinner's corresponding operationalist philosophy of science, the notion that concepts are meaningful if and only if they can be verified, measured by some simple, straightforward observation, once had its day among working philosophers, but no longer. But none of this matters if one's goal is to manage large enterprises such as a school system with minimal friction. Behaviorist learning psychology is well fitted to at least two distinct sorts of endeavors. First of all, to the operation of the neoliberal mentalité, which draws little distinction between education and training in the first place in seeking to maximize ROI for human capital. Secondly, for the practice in which education or government, etc., is no different from any other business enterprise. They're generalized managerial skills which apply across the board, content withstanding. And that leads us to the second component of learning management systems, management. Something subject to direction by discipline, neutral, generalized expertise. The whole point of conceptualizing education as learning is to grease the skids of central management. To manage large enterprises with minimal friction is the goal of those in charge of K-12. Anyone who might object, for example, that training in shop or home economics not at all like teaching history or literature or AP chemistry, anybody who might object that Bildung matters, that regurgitation is not education, that method doesn't trump disciplinary understanding, that not everything that counts can be counted, is simply ruled out of order from the start. There are certain things which are thinkable and certain things which are unthinkable. This is the kind of thing which Doksa governs. I noticed that although they're called schools of education and might thus be expected to govern education more generally, in fact, they're involved exclusively with K through 12. Hitherto, teachers in higher education have not needed certification by them to practice, as K through 12 teachers do. In the public schools, people cower before and kowtow to that mighty EDD degree holder. But, miracle of miracles, somehow this high watermark doesn't command nearly the same deference among university folk. Skinnerian learning psychology lives in a time warp, just like market fundamentalism, incidentally. The high science pretentiousness of, quote, operationalizing, quote, unquote, we hear this a lot, all concepts so as to make them measurable by simple glimpse went away with the demise of logical positivism, and that's been some time ago for those who know science, even though it remains so cool among schools of education and their K through 12 charges. Just as accountancy is not the only conception of accountability, nor does data-drivenness exhaust the notion of empiricism, a concept-free glimpse is not the only idea of observability. Skinnerians and the like succeed in bandying about buzzwords such as accountability, observability, operational definition, measurability, data-drivenness, etc., because their interpretive twists echo favorably a residual positivism in general culture. It is one in which science, always capitalized, gives us access to certain truth, capitalize that too, which then needs only be applied by technocracy. But simply to notice intellectual credibility, and this is a key point, it's not whether behaviorism is true, what a quaint notion these days, but whether and how behaviorism remains useful. Meaning is use and use, meaning that is all you know on earth and all you need to know. Simple as that. Operationalism and learning have not to do with philosophy or intellectual cogency at all. They have everything to do with Mandarin utility. High science pretentiousness allows legislators to simplify accountability. It allows Mandarins to exert managerial control over K through 12 and perhaps to expand that control. It allows federal and state accountants equally simple measures to guarantee oversight and to do so with uniformity. Let me give an example of this, although it's a central example. Charlotte Danielson's framework for teaching, widely adopted as the basis for teacher evaluation in K through 12. It gives a detailed task analysis, 76 elements in teaching, count them, there they are on the chart, whereby an evaluative checklist can be generated. My local public school district, for example, used to have a 2-page evaluation form bubble in observations. It now has a spreadsheet based on this framework for teaching stretching over 31 pages. So, very simple. Here's what science tells us. Science is certain truth. Well, that's all settled. We just have to get on with the application. Recently, Danielson herself has criticized the use of her schema. She protests that, quote, I'm deeply troubled by the transformation of teaching from a complex profession requiring nuanced judgment to the performance of certain behaviors which could be ticked off on a checklist, unquote. In other words, she blames the application by school officials who she says are often not trained to do the kinds of observations they need to do, rather than blaming the concept itself. What result would one expect from a whole school of education high science approach, treating education as learning, breaking teaching down by task analysis, then noting all the discrete observable tasks in 30 plus pages of spreadsheet, except just this sort of reductive checklisting about which then its originator has second thoughts. Reductive checklisting is a feature, not a bug, of this approach. Isn't it precisely the very basic high science school of Doksa that lies at the root of this? Danielson is kind of like Captain Lionel.
How can it close me up on one ground? I'm shocked to find that gambling is going on in here. You win. Oh, thank you very much.
Yes, she's shocked to find that performance can be ticked off on the checklist. Once the Mandarins of Methodology start assuring the school bureaucrats that education is but simply observable and simply measurable learning, unquote, unquote, and given that such bureaucrats, along with legislators, need to manage large workforces in as frictionless a manner as they can, why express surprise at the results? Checklist reductionism is perfectly suited. If and when the doxa of K through 12 spreads to higher education, should we be surprised at similar results? The new Mandarins of Methodology. The charter to rule education on the part of neoliberal managers resembles what Chomsky some time ago called the new Mandarins. The new Mandarins are not literati like the old imperial Chinese Mandarins, but they claim mystical clerical competence over all things above control by, much less even the ken of a merely laic demos. So, Robert McNamara, your quintessential new Mandarin. Chomsky's new Mandarins were whiz kids in the McNamara fashion, ostensibly liberal academics who claimed general administrative expertise, particularly over the conduct of the war in Vietnam, and who contrasted their tough-minded, grown-up realism invidiously with those littler kids and their profs, really spinning their wheels at all those teach-ins. New Mandarins were experts, and expertise as such lay beyond rebuttal and even questioned by amateurs, that is, lay people outside the Mandarinate. Part of their expertise is that, and again, McNamara is a great example of this, they manage by number crunching. Before we started to talk about data-driven decision-making, they were already on that page. Who are the new Mandarins, the potential learning managers of higher education going to be? One need look no further than their predecessors, those in university schools of ed long responsible for manufacturing and certifying K through 12 teachers, Mandarins claiming monopoly over methodology of behavioral learning outcomes. Unlike in imperial China, these Mandarins are not master literati, but masters of methodology and tough-minded data-drivenness. Just as a surplus of degree holders provides a reserve labor army of adjuncts, there are plenty of people trained in the doxa of K through 12 in schools of education who might move into positions of learning management to the extent that distance education expands its turf in higher education. The whole raison d'etre of schools of education has been that they specialize in method, capitalize that, technique rather than disciplinary subject matter. Simply couple general expertise in method with generalized non-specialist techniques for administration, and one has the new Mandarins of methodology. In other words, new Mandarins are not so very new. They predate whiz kids. As Flexner noted again almost a century ago, from the beginning, the whole point of university schools of education is that they act as masters of generalized teaching methodology in contrast to specialized disciplinary competence. A school of education, says Flexner, is an undertaking to tell how to persons who do not know what. Methodology, in other words, an undertaking to tell how to persons who mainly do not know what. And an education major, how much more so the possessor of that august EDD degree, knows what works in teaching and learning. A principal or other instructional leader is empowered to scrutinize in a walkthrough and a glimpse the performance of the English teacher, the AP chemistry teacher, the maths teacher, the PE teacher. All differences are mere content. Methodology is what counts, and generalized administrative expertise cuts across any specific competence or content. Hey, it's science. McNamara provides a great example, a good object lesson of what happens when pure method and data-driven statistical control prevail. This is how he ran forward. Numbers almost always outweighed qualitative issues, design, aesthetics, engineering, and numbers were self-interpreting, as his biographer tells us. When he got to the Defense Department in Vietnam, likewise, numbers, kill ratios, so we know how that worked out, were taken to trump qualitative issues about what those numbers were supposed to indicate. As long as you had numbers coming out of the field, they're self-interpreting. And how's that working out? Most of the lessons drawn from McNamara's life, says his biographer, have been negative. That management by numbers ruined America's manufacturing know-how, just for starters. When he left the World Bank in 1981, Ford Motor Company was fighting for its existence almost as hard as it had back in 1946 when he and the Whiz Kids were brought on to resurrect it. I think this is not just a minor example. McNamara is worth calling to mind today as the voices of Mandarin methodology, management by methodology, likewise try to bully people with their alleged tough-mindedness and superior grasp. The first time as tragedy, the second time as farce. The track record of Whiz Kids, whether you're looking at Ford or Rand Corporation, whether the omnicompetence of an MBA or the omnicompetence of an EDD, kicking down the same unrebuttable, settled science, it's not been a very good one. Doing the same thing again, but expecting different results defines exactly what? Old-time market fundamentalism was eclipsed for a good reason. Why should it get that second bite at the apple? The same might be said for Mandarin bluffing and bullying. Fully a century ago, Veblen skewered powerful university presidents as captains of erudition, he called them, who thought themselves the functional equivalent of captains of industry and who attempted to govern higher education with business-like means. Today, being a captain of industry automatically confers status also as a captain of erudition. The rich, no less than the new Mandarins of Methodology, possess the science of education and know just how to apply it. A broadened Mandarinate, though, remains a Mandarinate. Mandarins remain oh so ready to name the best practices without ever having to explain to the laity how and why they might be best. Is there really some high science of instructional leadership vested in billionaire boys and EDD holders alike? An expertise inscrutable to and unrebuttable by mere laity? Can it really be so simple? And that brings us to the third and final bit of learning management systems system, which I'm going to characterize as something uniform across large organizations and a wide range of activities. That's not the only way to think about systems. For example, interconnectedness is another conception, but I want to focus instead here on system as subordination and regularization of action. It seems to me there are two distinct causes for concern here with the system bit of learning management systems. First of all, the nature of an LMS as such leads to uniformity and decreases the motley associated with academic freedom. Secondly, legislative requirements for monitoring distance education go far in the direction of displacing the accustomed doxa and direction of higher education in favor of the doxa and governance of K through 12. The first issue concerns the nature of an LMS as such. To deploy an LMS is partially to outsource control of instruction, vesting it in an organization external to the school. Control is therefore also at least partially outside routine school direction, as well as any collective bargaining and associated appeal and grievance procedures. Individual schools or systems of schools may have some wiggle room in as much as they may choose among, as previously noted, some 250 plus LMS vendors, but any one of them must impose some uniformity at the expense of modeling. For clients of any given LMS, the entire school and the whole range of other clients is subject to uniform requirements about how instruction can and will be conducted. A common system imposes uniform constraints upon instruction. An LMS is an organization outside the control of organizations of higher education, such as colleges and universities. So, firstly, unlike actual colleges and universities, the LMS is not an organization invested in Bildung, invested in the doxa of higher education. Secondly, already, as I shall illustrate presently, the LMS vendor organization exhibits an affinity for the doxa of K through 12. Thirdly, its scale of operations give it an elective affinity with the sort of friction-free, kick-downward management which the doxa of K-12 eases. The scale of the LMS is large, much like that of state and county level boards of education who find K-12 governance already so useful. Scale conduces to greater uniformity. The LMS has definite incentives to move in the direction of K through 16. At this juncture, let me clarify two issues that might otherwise cause confusion. The point about system is not primarily a point about either technology or even distance. First of all, to raise questions about LMSs is not necessarily to disdain digital technology. People who do this sometimes get tagged with this. David Noble in Digital Diploma Mills, by the way, I think worth reading, reports being dismissed as a technophobe. But he makes the point, before Diploma Mills had access to digital technology, they had access to the US Postal Service. There was a whole era of correspondence courses from the 1890s to the 1930s, and Flexner's book on universities helped to drive the last nail in that coffin. Particularly, he focused on Chicago and Columbia and the way in which they were watering down education through these correspondence courses, which share, this is what Noble's good for, share many features with digital distance learning today. One reason LMSs became attractive to higher education is that they provide a way of competing for tuition dollars with for-profits and diploma mills. The more public colleges and universities, of course, come to depend on tuition dollars, the more this competition increases, hence Noble's phrase, digital diploma mills. And again, there's a track record there. Secondly, to raise questions about LMSs is not necessarily to disdain distance. I'll speak from my experience. I've had limited experience with distance education, though I have considerable experience, a matter of decades, with higher education. In the past, for example, I've had the opportunity to teach what were then called ITV courses, to lectures delivered via TV broadcast. I've declined to do that in as much as I agree with Camille Paglia that teaching is a performance art, and I think that stage is better than screen. That's not to say that distance may not have value. Is YouTube useless? Or how are we watching this lecture? Was Sunrise semester useless? Distance education is great for some kinds of training. I learned loads about computer hacks watching YouTube videos. Nevertheless, DE may not be great for all subjects, nor as a primary medium for higher education. My initial experience with distance teaching has come recently in spring 2020, the last semester, during the initial stages of the COVID pandemic. Digital distance seemed the best option in that emergency, and thus I converted my class from face-to-face to a hybrid format involving teleconferencing to continue lectures and continue to hold office hours. And I discovered that doing this had some advantages and some disadvantages. Already in my face-to-face classes, I used PowerPoint, so with hybrid but synchronous classes, it was an easy transition using Zoom. Already, also, I was in frequent email contact with my students, so that continued as well, very little changed. Here are the advantages and disadvantages I noticed. First of all, Zoom cloud recordings make it easier potentially for students to catch up on lectures and to augment class notes. Secondly, starting out face-to-face, I then had some match of names to faces, so I was continuing an earlier process. My preferred method with primary text explication to text is quicker and more fluid when the instructor reads the passage aloud, absent of face-to-face classroom. I used to have the students read the passages. I discovered this works a little better. Ability to go hybrid with infrastructure in place saved an emergency, because if this had happened before, let's say, 2007 and the advent of smartphones, it would have been sunk. But there were some disadvantages. Smartphone proliferation aside, there remains some digital divide, particularly for poorer students. I cannot proctor exams, therefore the kind of in-class exam I used to give is out. I have students write all essays. And perhaps we could do, at some point in the future, once we get campus access back, we can filter IP addresses in a lab in the library, for example, and do exams that way. I don't know, some possible option. And one of the things that I most miss, I suppose, is I can't assess deer in the headlights by asking questions, by probing for student understanding that I used to do. That's just not possible with Zoom. But the upshot of my recent brief experience is to conclude that distance can work in a pinch. It was better for the students to finish the semester that way than not to have finished at all. In spring 2020, I think my students lost very little, whereas they might very well have lost quite a lot. At the same time, if I could incorporate the cloud recording with face-to-face lectures in the future, perhaps continue to read the passages in class myself, this would give all the advantages with none of the disadvantages. Furthermore, because this class started face-to-face, we were able to keep our accustomed synchronous class time Distance would be much different with only asynchronous contact, which is the norm using the LMSs. I've been describing an emergency situation, and my conclusion is that in this particular emergency, a synchronous hybrid distance solution has been better than nothing. It's been much better. This is, however, a far cry from endorsing normalization of emergency measures. For fall 2020, the current semester, Cambridge is going online for all of its offerings. Now, this has produced some grumbling. It's $40,000 graduate tuition at the moment. People paying that $40,000 are worried they're not going to get the Cambridge experience. Indeed, they're not. Students at other prestigious schools have been rumbling as well. One need not take a narrow ROI perspective to see the point. Even if there is some room for distance education, there comes a point at which liberal education suffers. As spring 2020 progressed, instructors on my campus were warned that without gaining LMS certification, teaching assignments might no longer be forthcoming. Initially, this was mandated for fall 2020, then the goalpost switch was postponed. But the message is, at some point in the near future, those who did not qualify for distance education certification could be left behind. The latest word is this might be starting in spring 2021. Despite misgivings, I decided to qualify just in case. In my system, this meant completing 2 courses online, each 4 weeks for a total of 40 hours each, using the very campus LMS over which we would be required to teach, Canvas in my case. I completed the first course. By the time I was a week in with the second course, it was becoming clear enough that the LMS system would require me to adopt practices and to conform to rules that I found sub-professorial and with which I was unwilling to comply. Furthermore, I learned that if I did complete full certification, I would no longer be able to be free to refuse distance education assignments, and this would reduce my relative seniority on campus, so I dropped out. I will not be teaching via an LMS. As a result of dropping out early, I'm left with but a hazy idea of all the details involved in conducting, I'm not sure teaching is the right word here, an asynchronous LMS distance course. Thus, I cannot give here anything like a definitive review and critique, but I can say that what I did gather was sufficient to give me pause. First, the asynchronous timing pretty much overrules my preferred methods for introductory philosophy. I have students read primary texts, I lecture, and then we read the text together. I use explication de text to go through and do a fine, close reading. Instead, I was being steered toward some of the familiar methods from K through 12 teacher training, group projects, team projects, togetherness, modular lesson plans, frequent spoon feeding, nudging, and hand holding, checklisting Bloom's taxonomy, very detailed statements of goals, then linked to very detailed objectives, constant deadlines, frequent exams, both formative and summative. Permit me to add a personal impression. During the semester I was trying as a teacher to adapt my face-to-face course to a distance hybrid format, I was experiencing as a student the asynchronous distance education model when I was trying to qualify for Canvas certification full bore. There was something about the experience to which I hope I would never subject my own students. I hope never to teach them in the second sense. There was constant focus on modular lessons, constant deadlines for numerous small assignments, a running points total on the dashboard. And I found myself cringing, frankly, in the way that I used to cringe back in high school and ceased to cringe once I got in higher education. And this is never a good thing. And this is not something I would want to inflict. It was quite joyless. It was déjà vu all over again. A vivid reminder to me of the Mickey Mouse I thought I had left behind, as I described it before. What does Kenneth Burke say? People may be unfitted by being fit in an unfit fitness. This is a fitness in which I do not wish to be fit. And all this stuff that I described is baked into the LMS system. This is just the 13th grade stuff from which I tried to wean my students. This is the creeping termite infestation. Dashboards, lesson modules, chains of goals linked to objectives, exam, quiz, exam, quiz, exam, drop-in surveillance by a clerk with a checklist. Whatever this is not teaching sense one. The system bit of LMS serves as pressure both to boost uniformity at the expense of motley, as well as to regress educational standards in the direction of hand-holding, spoon-feeding, and Mickey Mouse micromanagement. Why should we regress? Why should we go back to teaching sense two? Is expanded distance education, amounting to K-16 under the aegis of an LMS, is it likely to provide the same sort of opportunity structure for students to attain Bildung and Eudaimonia as did the sort of opportunity structure which expanded post-World War II? In what sense would this kind of thing expand their life chances? The second cause for concern has to do with legal mandates to monitor the content of distance education. In the case of my campus, both the California Ed Code, Title V, 55204, and the Accrediting Commission for Community and Junior Colleges, ACCJC, require that online courses be monitored for compliance with the rule that there be, quote, regular and effective contact, usually abbreviated REC, among instructors and students. In addition, the campus itself has instituted local policies, already mentioned above the REC checklist, to ensure, monitor, and document compliance. Thus far, this is required of online distance education only, ostensibly to ensure that distance education rises to the customary standards of face-to-face instruction. Well, I mean, who could quarrel with quality control in the abstract? And yet, customarily, the instructor of record has been trusted to know their job and do their job. What is special about distance education that now suddenly should cause a special effort to prevent malfeasance? Why is malfeasance expected? Such a movement from trust to monitoring is a move from the customary direction of higher education in the direction of the typical governance of K through 12. What the LMS adds is a ready-made tool to monitor constantly and at will all sorts of classroom goings on. An LMS is a panopticon. Monitors lurk and peer into each cell, each virtual classroom, not in the manner of a traditionally scheduled personnel evaluation, but in the manner of a K through 12 principal walkthrough. Only it is not just the chair or the dean, it's now any lurking distance education clerk. Let me ask you a question. What would be the response to a college administration that proposed to install CCTV cameras in every physical classroom? Well, first of all, in my state, that's illegal. Recording is illegal, at least, although it's not clear that surveillance is. But exactly this sort of ongoing surveillance is baked into the learning management system. Why wouldn't an online panopticon become subject to the law of the hammer? Here's the law of the hammer. You may know it if not by name. Give a small boy a hammer and he finds that everything he encounters needs pounding. If it can be monitored, will it be monitored? Indeed, as their local way of fleshing out Title V and ACCJC mandates, my campus has already detailed requirements about first week activities, response times, frequency of required class discussions, and so forth. If these detailed teaching regulations are now needed to ensure that distance education meets the minimal standards of face-to-face instruction, will there develop a dialectic in which this innovation is turned around, such that face-to-face instruction too must be micromanaged as if it were K through 12, so as to rise to the new standards, the best practices, if you will, of distance education? Why can't instructors be trusted any longer to maintain REC, regular and effective contact with students, as typically they have been? Again, to teach in sense one denotes what's done by a motley, differentiated, trusted, competent member of an academic discipline possessed of Lehrfreiheit, academic freedom. To diminish trust in this way is to deprofessionalize. To move from teaching in sense one to teaching in sense two is a diminution.
And the termites are destroying my home. We want action now.
Get out of the Orkin Man.
until the organ man, until the organ man, to control your pest, organ his bed, fall until the organ man.
Aha!
Oh. To control your pest, organ his bed, fall until the organ man.
Yeah, so where's Otto? Why can't instructors be trusted any longer to maintain regular and effective contact with students as typically they have? We might have asked the same question earlier when SLOs, student learning outcomes, were required. What teacher would not naturally think about where their instruction's going, that they have to be compelled to document it regularly? Insulting, as Gilbert Hyatt would say, and he would be right. SLOs were the thin end of the wedge. LMS is the next wave. Desensitization occurs. What next? Something bigger, perhaps. Once panopticon, classroom surveillance, and checklists are institutionalized for distance education, is there anything preventing them from becoming best practices for all instruction? We might beware the easy, stealthy progression of decision accretion and mission creep. Again, the worrisome things about LMS are neither A, that it uses digital technology, nor even B, that it involves distance. It is rather that first, LMS diminishes motley and increases uniformity, and secondly, the procedures of governance from the doxa of K through 12 are being mandated from outside, both by law and by organizational outsourcing. In short, the shifted demography of teaching in higher education in favor of an expanded Tier 2 makes it more likely that a K through 12 model will come to prevail, resulting in K through 16. The likelihood increases given a combination of no pushback from Tier 1 faculty and their unions, plus legislative mistrust of distance education, if not also of teachers as such, and the intrusion of outside vendor organizations in the form of LMS makes it even more likely that a K through 12 model will be adopted as it was in K through 12 because it is more amenable to central management. It would be a great loss when it becomes no longer possible to teach in Sense 1. The motley population, those last professors of Donahue's, who might resist this drift toward K through 16 standards are a dwindling breed, one funeral at a time. The majority adjunct precariat can hardly resist. As the standards of digital diploma mills displace humanistic education, to the same extent will we lose that great post-war American achievement whereby liberal higher education promised to augment the life chances for large swaths of students. So, we might ask the question, which has been asked before, under which liar? Pas besoin d'être Jérémie pour deviner le sort qui m'est promis, as the poet says. We're caught between the Jeremiah of Mr. Chicken Little and Miss Pollyanna Whittier. It may be a false dilemma. One of the salutary things about reading history is that, as Alvin Goldner says, it insulates us from the vulgarities no less than the gratifications of the present. Apart from its being liberal most in a very narrow sense, neoliberalism isn't very neo either. And the new Mandarins are not all that new on the same way. Been there, done that. Much of this we have seen in various forms in the past. Nor, for that matter, are some of the conditions for the further advancement of neoliberal mentalité and higher education particularly new. Chicken Little doesn't get much help if one has read Flexner or Veblen or Shelley Halsey, or for that matter, Burton Clark or Jonathan Cole. The received narrative declension from Golden Age to Big Bad Wolf is easily overstated and has been stated many times in the past. Consider, for example, what Auden had to say on this score as long ago as 1948 in his poem, Under Which Liar?
Keep well the Hermetic Decalogue, which runs as follows. Thou shalt not do as the dean pleases. Thou shalt not write thy doctor's thesis on education. Thou shalt not worship projects, nor shalt thou or thine bow down before administration. Thou shalt not answer questionnaires or quizzes upon world affairs, nor with compliance take any test. Thou shalt not sit with statisticians, nor commit a social science. Thou shalt not be on friendly terms with guys in advertising firms, nor speak with such as read the Bible for its prose, nor above all make love to those who wash too much. Thou shalt not live within thy means, nor on plain water and raw greens. If thou must choose between the chances, choose the odd. Read the New Yorker, trust in God, and take short views.
Notice Auden sets forth his bleak vision, EDD theses, bowing down before administration, truth replaced by useful knowledge, commercial thought, public relations, hygiene sport. Precisely at that time when Brown's golden age of expanded liberal education was unfolding. Just when Aries at last has quit the field, a new skirmish erupts. The GI Bill became but the opening salvo in a broadening of hermetic life chances for a wider range of people. Encamped upon the college plain, raw veterans already trained as freshman forces in 1946. Some of the same things about which Auden complains could also come right out of Flexner in 1930, right out of Veblen in 1918, as also we complain today, saith Koheleth. In the line just prior to Keep Well, the Hermetic Decalogue bit of his poem, which we heard him read, Auden imagined seeing routed Apollo's battalions melt away like fog. In 1946, it was, or so he seemed to think, still a live question as to which lyre might prevail, or as we might say now, which doxa might prevail within higher education. Is Apollo's battalions the right imagery out to capture the stealth advance of neoliberal mentalité? Perhaps not. Yet, if Brown is to be credited, Auden's Hermetic franc-tireur did make some headway in the wake of World War II over something, by way of advancing, so to say, a conduct of conduct. Expanded liberal education for the demos was an achievement then, just as it is in peril of undoing now. You know, there's a difference. Even when faced with Sputnik, no one called for the truncation of all education merely to STEM. Nobody called for the kinds of measures which we're seeing now. Nobody called for the university to become primarily a vocational enterprise to deliver ROI and the biggest bang for the buck, so forth, as some people do today. So, seems to me, Chicken Little doesn't get the last word. But Pollyanna does not prevail either. After World War II, this nation built both the greatest system of research universities and the greatest expansion of liberal education in history. Today they face serious threats. Both theses are true simultaneously. And the post-war era, says Brown, was a time in which a broad, if not deep, college education, when inclusive of the arts, letters, and sciences, became an essential element of middle-class membership. No mere instrument for economic advancement, higher education in the liberal arts was the door through which the descendants of workers, immigrants, slaves, entered onto the main stage of history to whose wings they were historically consigned. Can we not do this again? The écoles glorieuses are not coming back any more than are the Rust Belt factories. But the U.S. is no third world power. There remains considerable wealth in American society. We might very well fashion an economy in which eudaimonia, building included, is once again more widely available. There were economic conditions then. We could think about economic conditions now. The golden age of post-World War II expanded liberal education, as described by Brown, had specific economic conditions. These put us, quote, on the verge of a society devoted to a life of art, literature, and contemplation, as Gerald Davis says in Managed by the Markets. The ancient Greeks would have seen the current moment as a turning point in human history, where only a tiny fraction of the population's hours are needed to produce all of the food, clothing, shelter, and material goods people need to live comfortably. We have not reverted to a pre-industrial third world situation at all. It's not that we've lost entirely the economic wherewithal that might have made the Hellenes envious, that might have made eudaimonia available to a broad demos. Is it not rather that America manages our wherewithal quite wrongly? So under which lyre might we find ourselves? Indeed, under which lyre? I've put together today a complex thesis. It says that a fairly recent but rapid secular change from corporate power to financialization has become the social basis for a Copernican revolution in thought, the growth of neoliberal mentalité. This has adverse consequences for education. The growth of LMS is one key instance. The diminution of education by LMS and the likelihood of K-16 is made more likely by the demographic transition to a largely adjunct professoriate. I can hope that my overall thesis is coherent. Maybe yes, maybe no. Even if no, it might remain true that the thesis that LMS diminishes or that the two tiers diminish are the case, either or, perhaps both. So what is to be done? What are you going to do? What would a solution look like? I'm not talking instant feasibility first and foremost. Although Comrade Lenin has had his shot, possibly Comrade Bernstein needs to have his. My friend Stephen Tipton wrote a book in the Sociology of Religion called Getting Saved from the 60s. Getting Saved from the 60s is about moral reaction. Reaction cut not only against free love, but also against the New Deal and the Great Society. It was about culture wars and the Cato Institute, as well as the turn to Jesus and the Reverend Mr. Moon. If we want to think seriously about counteracting the intrusion of neoliberal mentalité into higher education, we need to think in broad terms about deliverance from a later decade and its fallouts, perhaps about getting saved from the 80s. It makes a difference whether we think about the prospect of a great society or whether we think with Mrs. Thatcher that there is no such thing as society. The first task is to get the issues and problems into focus. Of course, proposals I'm going to propose below could hardly happen absent a major political transformation, one in which goods would be more equitably distributed, in which housing, healthcare, education, etc. would be entitlements, something along the lines of FDR's Second Bill of Rights, for example. And again, my crystal ball is as good as anyone's. I'm getting to be an old guy, and I have seen recently what I thought I would never see in American politics. That is the rise of the likes of Ms. Warren, Mr. Sanders, Ms. Ocasio-Cortez. And, you know, it'll take lots of different things to bring about that magnitude of change. But it surely looked a lot different a decade ago. We'll see how it looks. Again, my crystal ball not working terribly well. It would need a revived concept of citizenship, aux âmes citoyens. Do we want people or do we want personnel? Are we here for the education of citizens or the training of human capital? As Brown argues, this is a key priority to get straight. And I'll put forward 5 theses in this regard. First of all, a deliberate, rational, planned policy to limit the number of graduate student admissions and the attempt to guarantee that the predictable percentage of graduates will match projected tenurable jobs is a must. Secondly, bring the adjunct tenurable ratio back into line as close to 0 as possible. Third, faculty unions need common, not divergent, interests to represent. Fourth, a concerted policy to bring distance or face-to-face to bring the distance face-to-face ratio as low as possible, and not to hold face-to-face to a diminished doxa. And fifth, termite control. Concerted pushback against the neoliberal mentalité and learning management. The first one. The reserve labor army of surplus PhD holders piles up because academic departments are rewarded based on enrollment. This entire legitimation structure needs to change. France once rationed teaching based on projected jobs. Jean-Paul Sartre himself once was excluded from passing agrégation on this basis. American academics need to reform job placement along such lines. If there wasn't a pileup of 250 applicants per job, there wouldn't be adjunct jobs. In the same way that police unions regulate their placement, academics need to regulate ours. Secondly, one of the few advantages K through 12 has to it is no tier 2, or perhaps all tier 2, but at least not a dual labor market. Single tier is their relative advantage. Equal work draws equal pay. Adjuncts make sense in professional schools in limited cases. Adjuncts make less sense in core academic subjects in colleges and universities, surely not in the majority. The 1-to-4 ratio from 1969 is better than our 2-to-1 ratio now, but it's still too high. Adjuncts need to be replaced with full-time tenured faculty. Number 3, why do teachers' unions provide for a common middle-class standard of living in K through 12, but not in higher education? Well, in higher education, members of the same bargaining unit act in a quasi-administrative capacity, department chairs, for example, hiring and firing, doling out assignments toward fellow members. These are less than fellow members. They are 2 adversarial tiers in the same union. Faculty unions collaborate in throwing sops to the adjuncts. As long as there remain second-tier adjuncts, what's the incentive to do better? The point, however, is to change it. Point 4, thou shalt not do as the dean pleases. Thou shalt not write thy doctor's thesis on education, nor sit with such as confuse education with learning and seek to manage it accordingly. The panopticon and the checklist are among the list of professional reforms that are simply sub-professional. In future, do we get to teach in Sense 1, or do we have to teach in Sense 2 instead? And number 5, termite control. It's bad policy to outsource control of instruction to an external vendor organization. It's bad policy to allow organizations with a bent toward the doxa of K-12 to burrow into higher education. Yes, Virginia, there is a sociology of yes men, and alas, such sociology is not monocausal. If a tier 2 precariat is not poised to push back, is tier 1, our unions, our faculty senates, the AAUP. Faculty associations need to work with legislators to ensure that law and bureaucracy do not erode the customary trust accorded to teachers under the doxa of higher ed. 5 points. Where's Otto? Is it possible yet to turn the situation around? Thank you for listening. This has been a talk on The Last Professor. My name is